Every 2 weeks, we are tackling some of the thorniest issues in tech society. And obviously, one of the major issues that we're trying to tackle right now is anti-racism. How can we be anti-racist with our technology and culture? I'm your host and moderator for today's discussion. My name is David Ryan Polgar. I'm the founder of All Tech is Human. All Tech is Human is an organization that accelerates tech consideration and is building out a hub for the responsible tech community. Also like to thank our partner for this discussion, which is TheBridge. They piece together the technologists, policymakers, and politicians. So check them out at thebridgework.com and check us out at alltechishuman.org. So now let's bring on our renowned experts for today's discussion. Really excited to have this. And I also want to emphasize to everybody watching our live stream that you can always comment, and we're going to see a bunch of the comments and bring a lot of them on screen. So first, we have Mutale Nkonde. She is the CEO of AI for the People and fellow at the Digital Society Lab at Stanford. So welcome, Mutale. We also have Charlton McIlwain. He is the author of Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice from the AfroNet to Black Lives Matter, and also a vice provost for faculty engagement and development at NYU. So welcome, Charlton. So actually, to give us a little context, and Mutale, we'll start with you. Is there anything else that you're working on career-wise that you think is relevant for our discussion today?
Yeah, so hi, everybody, and thank you for this kind invitation. I started an organization so that I could commission research into the unique ways that advanced technical systems impact Black lives, and then develop interventions. And I just felt that that was a real gap in the civil society market. And one of the things that we're really interested in right now is the way that disinformation agents are operating, specifically on the Twitter platform, but we are looking across platforms. So that's the project that we're deeply engaged in. We are in the analysis, we have our data sets, and we were pretty excited to see Kanye West show up in some of that dialogue in recent days. So seeing where that goes, and then when we're not trying to protect democracy, which is no small feat, also delighted to work with you, David, on being a recent member of the TikTok Content Moderation Board.
And on that point, Mutale, since you also mentioned some of the research on Twitter's platform, what would you say you're seeing as social media's level of responsibility towards tackling some of the anti-racism and this overall kind of culture? Do you have any kind of overall thoughts on social media's responsibility?
I did. I come from policy, and while I was looking at policy advocacy around AI specifically, I was really interested in the way that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act has been interpreted to really absolve tech companies of responsibility for the messages that are operating on their platform. And one of the things that I've always been interested is the spirit in which that regulation was written. And that becomes really, really important from a legal perspective, because the spirit of the law is as important of enforcement. And when it was written, my belief is it was written with goodwill. We would protect free speech on the internet with goodwill. However, when you're looking at some of these nefarious actors, I do think that there is a space for social media companies themselves to step in. So even in the process of this particular project, we have watched in real time Twitter decide that they're going to label the president's tweets. Twitter decide that they're going to make sure people read things before they retweet. So it's not impossible, but the question becomes, is the will there?
And then Charlton, let's bring you in onto the conversation outside of Black Software. I'm curious, any of the projects you're working on, or also even just some of the reception right now with your book?
Yeah, thank you. Most of my free time, which there's very little, my day job is really as a higher education administrator, working at an institution where these issues are really front and center. That is, thinking about inclusion, equity, diversity, and thinking very much about technology. And so how do we build the capacity for researchers, for faculty, for scholars to elevate, think about the work of technology and what it means to think about anti-racist technology, to think about what it is, what the impact of technology is in our social environment that's very much framed on and built on a foundation of race, racialization, racial inequality. And so a lot of the work I do is really about trying to build a capacity for many scholars, but particularly for Black voices, scholars of color, to be front and center in this work. These are voices that have always been around, but not very well integrated into the public landscape and visibility. And so much of what I try to do is to build spaces for scholars of color to speak and to really impact the social, political, policy landscape when it comes to these important questions about race and technology.
I know it's a large question, Charlton, but a lot of people are probably familiar with the movie Hidden Figures, about some of the women who were influential on NASA's research. Why do you think this problem has perpetuated for so long, where a lot of Black voices were not being kind of put front and center?
Yeah, I think it's historically it's deliberate. It is a way of curtailing what was seen to be threatening voices that really threatened our existing racial social order. And so I think it's no surprise when we look at sort of the rapid development of computing in the 50s, 60s, and throughout, and the ways in which that particular moment when issues about race and civil rights really clashed with issues of technology as they were emerging, and simply that people that looked like Mutale and myself were seen and defined at that time as threats to a system that wanted to protect a very particular order. And so I think in many respects, historically, certain voices have been deliberately excluded. And to the degree that they have not been, I think it's a process of simply building on what is there. If historically those voices are not there, people come to think that those voices are not there, not present, not valuable, and we don't go looking for them. But it's amazing what you find and who you find and the stories you find when you go looking for those other voices.
Well, just actually a case in point, I heard the other day, someone said something about, hey, well, there weren't a lot of Black cowboys. And I said, well, actually, no, that's historically inaccurate. And that it's usually just the representation from Hollywood that has allowed us to have this perception that there weren't actually a lot of Black cowboys, when in fact there were. So I'm interested, Mutale, we'll go over to you. I'm interested of what you see with the connection between technology design and also culture, right? Is there a symbiotic relationship between the two about anti-racism, designing better technology, and also how does that get influenced by the overall culture that seems to be ingrained right now in Silicon Valley specifically?
So I will point out that Charlton is a famed cultural theorist, so I'm gonna give it my shot. And
then we'll go back. Yeah. We get some talented people with this live stream, so it's always good to have the top experts.
Please don't be too cruel, but I am a lifelong journalist and communicator, and within that role, really spent the first 10 years at the BBC looking at the questions of how do we develop culture around technology. But in the BBC context, it was white culture. It was white people. It was the way that white people socialize. What I've seen through my career, because I came into tech through D&I verticals, specifically through Black Girls Code and a partnership that they had with Google. And when they were thinking about creating a culture for inclusivity within the company, it really did not go beyond hiring those people. And it really did not go beyond putting them on websites or pushing them out. And I interface with external external affairs. So there was this huge visibility of me and the work I was doing, whereas in the engineering ranks and in the management ranks, where decisions around product management, deployment, governance systems, and the way we were lobbying government were all heralded by white and Asian men, most primarily, and their goal was to maximize profit. So they weren't looking at race or racism. And when it was brought up, they had what Eduardo Bernardo Silva calls a colorblind approach to racism. And what that basically meant was there was no race, there was no racism, so we're not going to look for ways that these systems could be used. And myself and other minority voices were saying, yes, but if you sell this technology to a law enforcement agency and the law enforcement agency then uses this technology to control Black bodies, it has a racialized impact. And then Kathy O'Neill was really the person that first influenced me back in 2016 to look at technical architecture. Mm-hmm. So it's a very long way of not answering your question, because I actually haven't seen the development of technologies that are optimized not to have impacts on, racist impacts. I haven't seen anybody changing their training data. I haven't seen anybody really willing to take financial hits, even though you could argue IBM tried with facial recognition. Mm-hmm. But what I have seen is an increasingly larger group of scholars and then practitioners like myself who work with the academy, to really expose that this is happening. And we just saw last month IBM, which wasn't doing very much work in facial recognition as it pertains to selling to police forces, making that critical link between technology, in this case it was facial recognition, and the way it impacts Black people. I don't know whether that was anti-racism because they were not a big player in that marketplace, but it did become a consideration in the Justice and Policing Act that was just entered to the House. So I would say, depending on how you feel about reform versus defund might be a different webcast. Mm-hmm. I would say that was the first time in my career that I had even seen really a nod for that outside of the bills that we entered. But the bills we entered were really to start the conversation and not get to law, because we have a hostile Senate, and then obviously our executive branch is what it is, and I'm not saying any more than that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a good way to go to this question we just received, and actually we're getting a ton of questions, so thank you for that, and keep them coming. But Mutale, from one of the things that you mentioned, and then actually I'll send this over to Charlton. So the question is exactly what happens after these individuals come into a company. So to really kind of emphasize that question, it seems to be getting at the fact that, hey, it's one thing, especially as somebody mentioned, diversity oftentimes is a corporate strategy. So if you are now inserting more individuals who are being underrepresented currently into the company, is that enough? Or is there something else that needs to change? So Charlton, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it goes back really to what Mutale mentioned, which I think hit the nail on the head when we start to think about what does it mean to have diversity in technology versus what does it mean to imagine, design, build, deploy anti-racist technology. And I think those two things are worlds apart, particularly as they've played out in our context. So whenever I get this question about what does anti-racist technology mean, what does that look like, I cannot help but think back to Roy Wilkins, who was once a president of the NAACP, and a particular op-ed that he wrote that I've read probably hundreds of times now and find so much significance and meaning in. And in there are a couple of quotes, and I'll read it. And I think it sums up for me what it means to have and think about anti-racist technology. He said this, he said, after the computer has defined on tape the ideal Holstein, could it not turn its impersonal, unprejudiced magic upon our ever agonizing race problem? Could it not, after digesting the facts which whites and blacks have fogged over for so long, give us an outline of our obligation? Instead of being a measure of the Negro's lag, cannot the computer become a guidepost to interracial justice and peace? For me, when I think about that quote, I think about what Wilkins was talking about, and that is thinking about technological systems that get used to deliberately speak to questions and issues of race. That is, that we design and imagine tools that think about how to minimize the risk of harm to racialized people, to communities of color, and more importantly, to think about that larger question and opportunity, which is we've thought about how to design technology to criminalize, to jail, to exclude, to disenfranchise people. What might it look like to deliberately think about, imagine, and build technological systems that create opportunity, that empower people of color, that ameliorate the structural systemic racism that has persisted and defined the US and in many respects the world. And so it's that deliberateness and willingness to talk specifically about race and social structure, and not to say, oh, we're going to build technology that's good for everyone, that is fair. No, we have to be willing to thinking about how technology and race specifically intersect.
Americans are infamously terrible at talking about race. I'm thinking specifically about the situation a couple of years ago with Starbucks, where they tried to do, let's talk about race. They were writing on the cards. That did not go over well. I'm curious, Charlton and Mutale, what do you see as good digital tools or platforms to have these really meaningful but difficult conversations that we're saying as a society we need to have, but we're also spending a lot of our lives online? So Mutale, I'll start with you. Do you see, like, is there an ideal platform for this, or maybe is this something that can only happen in person? What are you seeing on your end?
So I don't know if there's an ideal platform, but I've certainly really enjoyed some of the podcasts that I've listened to. And Brene Brown did a really interesting, I think it's 40 minutes, where she talks about shame. And it's a podcast that is designed for white people, to talk to white people who feel shame around racism as it relates to seeing George Floyd die, and also embarrassment that it took them to this moment to actually realize that this was happening. And she points out in that podcast how some steps that can be taken to both address that, but then what are good action points afterwards. And the reason that I really loved it was that she also talked about cancel culture, which is a big news story now with the Harper's piece. And she really spoke about the need for minoritized and often attacked communities to be able to hold power to account using the internet and protecting that right, and how, you know, demonstrations against it are a form of racial silencing and racial, really racial hostility, because the people that are canceling are often the weakest. They're often Black women online. And so I would definitely encourage people to seek out people that are working in the mental health space, people that are working in the psychology space, who also specialize in helping facilitate these conversations. One of the early papers I wrote was a paper called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech. And it was really informed by my experiences within companies, right? And one of the things that we did is that we borrowed a framework from Howard Stevenson, who's a psychologist at UPenn. And one of the things that he pointed out and we were able to use was this idea that in order to have that difficult conversation, you have to first acknowledge the history and the presence of racism. I mentioned colorblind racism in one of my earlier responses. If you do not think racism is happening, then you're probably not you're not paying attention, and that's poor. And you should seek to. Then get to the emotional part. What stops you talking about race? Because I would argue, as a Black woman, I don't necessarily walk around thinking about racial injustice every day, even though that has been the news cycle persistently over the last few months. But I'm certainly aware of the space that I'm in. There are places that I won't go. Even coming on here, I had to be very clear about my boundaries and what I could accept and what I couldn't accept. And then once you have that understanding of the history and histories of race, you're probably not going to see Black people as drug addicts, because you'll know about the 1984 Anti-Drug Act, which made, you for 5 grams of crack, you would get a minimum 5-year sentence, but for 500 grams of powder cocaine, which is the same drug, you would get the same sentence. So there is this policy, racist outcome. And then once you know all of that, you know racism exists, you know that it's uncomfortable, but you know how to manage your uncomfortability and lean into that. What's your action plan? And one of the things that I think has been really beautiful in terms of the platform has been the Streets of America. They have been my favorite platform. Watching Black and white people march to say Black Lives Matter beats any online platform. What activated them? Why they doing that work, and follow them. But I would say that discomfort about race amongst white people is a conversation that white people need to have with each other, because I think that there's healing there, and I think that there can be power there. And the impacts of anti-Black racism on the Black psyche and the Black spirit and the Black imagination is the work that Black people need to do, because we need to heal from that. And going back to one of the earlier questions about what happens when people are in companies, well, for AI for the People, we actually have a therapeutic practice where we invite in mental health professionals to help us do this work, because we have to heal from the impacts of racism. And that's the only way, for me at least, to make sure that when I'm working with formerly incarcerated youth or folks who are marginalized, who I want to bring into this field, that we even are in this psychic space to reimagine the industry.
I have an interesting question that Kevin just brought up. Charlton, I'll have you go with this one first. Can technologies be truly anti-racist when they are so tied to commerce and consumption products? The classism in access to these tools is tied to the existing structures of suppression, ? So Charlton, what do you think about that? Can technologies be truly anti-racist given their tie-ins with our structures?
That's a great question, and it I hesitate to ask because it brings out the sort of pessimism in me, and that folks often, I think, don't like to hear, and publishers have said don't really sell books very well.
No need to be optimistic. We're seeking the truth.
But I think it does raise the question, and maybe later we'll talk a little bit about facial recognition technology and so forth. And I think this embodies that in many respects. That is, building anti-racist technology isn't something that you just jump into, a design studio, and decide you're going to build, right? Or to develop. It is as much about understanding a historical landscape and dynamics about race and exclusion than it is perhaps anything else. And so thinking deeply about what that is and what that means, and then thinking about developing technology based on that, it's a hard sell, because ultimately what you have to confront is, can we have anti-racist technologies while still living in an environment that is deeply and fundamentally racist? And I think the answer to that is really no, right? And so when we think about steps that we can take in that direction, I think also those challenges are great. Those steps are big. There's no way to think about building anti-racist technology when we have technologists who don't even understand race, or who refuse to talk about or think about the connections of race and technology. And so from my perspective, a first step to even thinking about anti-racist technology on a grand scale requires that computer scientists and engineers and technologists know as much about things like redlining and disparate impact theory of racial discrimination, histories of educational inequity, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and civil rights, as much as they know about how to code or design an algorithm or build predictive modeling. And until that point, I think it is a high bar to think of truly building, designing, deploying anti-racist technologies. I think we can make steps, but as the questioner sort of insinuates, it's no small task.
So, Mutale, I'll send it over to you. What would be some of those steps? How can we, to Charlton's point, if technologists are not having these uncomfortable conversations about race and are not thinking about some of these entrenched systems that can be and should be dismantled, how do we go about that? Is this about training technologists, about changing the curricula? What do you think are some of the next steps?
You have to dismantle capitalism to really get.
That's a big statement. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the question is getting to, but if we're not going to dismantle capitalism, then we have to add new incentives. So one of the things that I worked on when I was in Congress was this idea of the Algorithmic Accountability Act. And we proposed really pie in the sky, because again, I'm a professional communicator and I'm interested in culture. We said, well, why don't we have an FDA type an FDA type agency that tests these algorithms. The IP laws don't allow us to go in and see them because they're proprietary data. But if they are found to have racialized impact, we won't use them. And when we were pitching this to lawmakers, we actually used the example of the Compass algorithm, which was famously written about by ProPublica. And the thing that was really interesting about that particular case was in 2014, then Attorney General Eric Holder actually wrote a paper in which he said, if we use risk scores in criminal justice, we are going to exacerbate racial bias. And really sent out this missive that said to judges and other folks that were using these tools, this is going to make your decisions more racist. Do not buy them. Everybody ignored him. Goes back to Charlton's earlier point around the erasure of the Black voice and the questioning of Black expertise. Go ahead, ProPublica, which is a journalistic outlet, tests 7,000 decisions of this algorithm for racist impact. And they find that not only is the tool ineffective, only 20% of the people it predicted would go and commit future crimes when and did so. If you are Black, you are 77% more likely to be given a longer bail sentence based on this nonsense technology. And that's one thing we're not talking about. We're talking as if these technologies work. Often they do not. Compass is one of many technologies that do not do what they say they're supposed to do. And so if we're thinking about, well, what were the incentives around that? Well, the incentive is to sell the algorithm. Whereas if we have antitrust laws, for example, that means that you can only build the thing that you know, Amazon, send me books, don't build facial recognition. If we also are testing algorithms for disparate impact and saying if it harms people in protected classes, those would be racialized, people who are negatively racialized, specifically Black, you cannot sell this. If we say that you cannot have hate speech online and operate in this market, then you will get some of these changes. Not that I think the government is to be trusted or government should have all power. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying with the present market structure, I don't see the incentives.
So Charlton, I'm going to ask you a question. I saw in one of the comments, we're talking a lot about anti-racism, especially anti-racist technology. It's a term that you see in the media a ton right now. Do we have any type of definition, or what's your personal definition when you're thinking about anti-racist technology?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that is technologies that are designed and imagined to undo racism, right? So if we think back to Roy Rilken's question, how can the computer solve our ever existing race problem, right? And to Mutale's point, do we have incentive to ask that question? Do we have incentive to really move on that question? I think the answer is no, but it doesn't mean that it's not a valid question. It doesn't mean it's not one that we could and should be asking. That is, instead of what will make me and my company and my shareholders more money, what will help create a more racially just society? We could ask ourselves that question. We could imagine and build technologies with that as our guiding motivation, but we don't, because there is no incentive to do so. And I think the incentive structure and that overall motivation is what has to change, and again is what makes me so often pessimistic, given the level of investment in technological disenfranchisement that has been part of this country's history. And so I'm thinking about, I think it was a couple of years ago that the Intercept came out with a story, and it was essentially that IBM was using NYPD camera footage, video footage, for the purpose of building AI that would help identify criminal suspects based on skin color, right? And so the real aha moment of the story was, A, this was happening, and this is extremely problematic. The other is that this was happening for 5 years under cover of darkness, that this company and the NYPD were colluding. And I remember reading that story at the time and kind of chuckling and saying, they missed the story altogether, because this is not a 5-year story. This is a 50-year one. And to think about a direct thread between IBM, the NYPD specifically, but IBM tech companies and the criminal justice system more broadly, that there's been a direct line from the mid-'60s up to the present that deeply invest in technological infrastructure designed specifically to ameliorate the threat posed by Black and brown people to the existing racial order. And so to think about anti-racist technology in an environment where this motivation, this incentive to criminalize, to disenfranchise, is so deeply ingrained in our structure, that is the kind of hurdle, the kind of challenge that we have to really tackle. And it is, again, it's a big one.
Well, that's the next question I want to ask. I'm seeing a lot of comments about facial recognition, which is obviously a very hot topic. And then, Mutale, you were recently on NPR talking about some of the issues around facial recognition. The question I have, though, for you, Mutale, is oftentimes we're talking about the accuracy of facial recognition, but there's the other question about, which I think goes more to Charlton's point, is should we even have the conversation about whether or not we want to be employing and deploying facial recognition? So where do you go with that question? Because on one hand, we have these statistics that always come out to say that Asian Americans and Black individuals are far more likely to be misidentified through facial recognition. But then you have the other situation of, okay, we could focus on improving facial recognition, or we could have the conversation about whether or not these should even be deployed in our communities. So where do you go with a question like that? Because it almost seems like they're opposing kind of parts to this.
So I think where I personally go, which is where Charlton has spoken about in terms of optimism, is that I challenge people to engage their radical imagination. Let's think about what facial recognition is used for. Facial recognition is used for the control of people, specifically Black people. And I would argue that it doesn't just go back to the 60s and 70s. Our colleague Simone Brown in 1995 wrote a book called Dark Matters, where she speaks about how in New York in the 18th century, they had a lantern law. So at the time, lanterns were the technology of the day. And if you were out at night and you were over 14 and you were someone racialized as Black, you were an enslaved person, you would have to hold a lantern up against your face because they were so scared about this threat of Black people who were not free, who were living under white control, basically getting up into the middle of the night and causing havoc, which in my opinion, they totally should have every day, no lanterns, but I wasn't there and it doesn't matter. And so what I would say is that facial recognition is such, and she argues this, I wouldn't say, she argues that facial recognition is part of that lineage. So if you live in Bed-Stuy as I do, and I go past a basketball, I can't even speak being in COVID, where people play basketball and there is
basketball court. Yep.
That's the one. I'm going to see this huge floodlight, right? Let's think about the people that are on basketball courts. These are typically young Black boys. So I'm of the opinion of, well, why don't we think of it? Why don't we live in a world where we are not trying to surveil Black bodies? And if we're going to ask that question, what are we using facial recognition for? We're using it really in the security business, really in the law enforcement business. You know, you can have a doorbell where you can see the person that comes to the door, but the company that produced the bill and therefore owns the image, because we do not own the IP of people that the person who takes the picture owns the IP. They have signed contracts with police forces across the country that says that your picture, your image, can be sold to them and then used for purposes of control and crime fighting. What if we didn't live in that world? What if we lived in a world where we exercise our constitutional right to privacy? That's the world I'm interested in. And in that world, we don't need facial recognition for those purposes. Now, where I have seen a great application of biometric technologies is in the animal world, where there is a pilot project in Zimbabwe where they're using that same technology and they've repurposed it to differentiate the stripes on zebra because it's becoming an endangered species. And they're able to use those same technologies to track zebra, identify them, make sure that they can live in the wild. And I think that that's an excellent use of biometrics because you're getting around these issues of civil and human rights. And what you're doing is actually engaging in life-affirming activity. The same for the ocean would be a great a great application. But in my view, the use of facial recognition for the purposes of incrimination and control should not be used on human subjects. And I'm famous for going to tech industries and saying, diversity and inclusion, please do not include me in my own degradation. That's not diversity and inclusion. Do not include me in data sets that will be used to turn around to criminalize people that look at me. Find something better to do. And it doesn't even work.
So we have a lot of technologists who are tuning in today and watching and listening. So one question, as we're kind of nearing the end of our time together, is this individual would love to hear more about practical things that can be taken on board by technologists to build their anti-racist knowledge. Where do they start? So we've clearly pointed out that the status quo is breaking or not sustainable. So where do you recommend, Charlton? I'll start with you. Where do you recommend for these technologists to learn more about this and to improve?
Well, I'll point out one group that I've had the good fortune of helping to found and sustain, which is the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. There you find 60, 70, 80 scholars of color who are doing this work, who deliberately think about the intersections of race, technology, power, inequality, and do so from a variety of vantage points. We are social scientists, computer scientists, artists, many, many different lawyers, journalists, data scientists, etc. And so I think that is a place, easy look up on Google to find us, and you find the work of all of these great people who have been writing, many for many years, other newer voices, but all who are doing this work and do so in a very accessible way. We have on the site a syllabus that we put together a year or so ago, which is a kind of, if you're going to start into this world, here are some basics in terms of what to read, what to be thinking about, questions to be asking. And so I think that's a good place to start. Find great voices, people of color, and read their work, talk about them, utilize them, discuss them in the workplace amongst technologist colleagues, etc.
I think our final question before we start wrapping it up, Mutale, with a lot of your work for AI for the People, it's focused on solving the underrepresentation problem in the tech industry by 2030. What do you see as some of the major steps or hurdles with solving this issue?
So many steps and hurdles, but we do it in 3 very systematic ways. I've actually been really lucky this year to have a partnership with NYU. So I made my first hire, and we used the syllabus that Charlton referred to because she had been on campus for 4 years, graduated, and never been able to take a class in this area. So it was very important for me to bring people up to speed. But from a programmatic standpoint, we as I said, conduct research into these questions specifically and do our own fundraising around those so that we can control the budgets and make sure that scholars that we can pull in to assist us with that work. And we have used the Critical Race and Digital Studies Network for that. We also have a racial justice lens to the way we organize our workspace. So as I was saying, we partner with the Social Action Lab at Columbia University, and they're a group of digital social workers that come in and help us think about, well, how do we look at a video of a Black person dying? Because that is very harmful to us. How do we communicate it out and create best practices for film, video, journalistic audiences to make sure that the dignity of Black death is maintained? We watched Mike Brown's body for 4 hours on the ground. Why are we still seeing that? We saw Philando Castro. So we're looking at best practices. We also interface with television, film, journalism, visual media, so that people can see us and see the work that we do, and then hopefully want to join us. And then this year, I did some guest lecturing again at NYU Stern. And in their kind of business and human rights courses, they had not heard of social entrepreneurship in this area and had wanted to join. So I think it's the combination of the right projects, the right work environment, the right partnerships, and then having a learning community even within. So as we hire, we're putting folks through this training, and our idea is that we can create leadership, because I'm certainly the product of investment by Charlton specifically, but even others who were willing to help me learn this, but then have been able to learn how to fund myself, sustain myself, and been in really prestigious environments that are completely hostile to the idea that I would want to do work on race and technology. So creating a physical space where that can happen. And then hopefully scaling ourselves. You know, AI for the People started in Brooklyn, New York. There's no reason why it can't be in Paris. There's no reason why it can't be in Mumbai. There's no reason why it can't be in Lusaka. I'm Zambian. Why not have it where I'm from?
So Mutale, for people who are watching and listening, where can people get in touch with you to learn more about your work, and especially to hopefully get involved?
Okay, so you're gonna laugh. Like, for all the fire I came from, I didn't think I would be successful, so I'm still building a site, believe it or not. I didn't. I didn't think I'd get one penny. I mean, that's a different webcast, but I really didn't think I'd be successful. So they can follow me on Twitter, which is at my name. We are building a site, which will be www.raceandtech.org. And they can, in your newsletter, I think through you, David, is a great way to reach me. You know, we're kind of comrades, as it were, and we're in touch. I think that you're a great person. And then I actually sit on the Critical Race website that Charlton spoke to me about. They have my picture, they have all my information, and they keep my latest work updated as well, which is really important. And I write I write, I'm very prolific. So
Mhm.
I just had something come out in Harvard African American Policy Review called Automated Anti-Blackness, which looked at facial recognition. But I've written on other things, and I have something coming up in Harvard's Misinformation Review as well about my latest project.
Terrific. And like you said, we'll include all this with our All Tech is Human newsletter that goes out a couple times a month. And then Charlton, what about yourself? Do you have any closing thoughts? And also, where can people buy your book, Black Software, and where can people stay in touch with some of your great work?
Thank you. As a sort of closing, I would just say we've been at this juncture, this moment before. There was a time 50 plus years ago where we could think about the intersection of race and technology and what the path forward looked like. We made the wrong decisions. We're seeing the repercussions of that every day today. I think our pace of technological advancement is continuing, ramping up in many ways. And so we have a moment to decide again, what will our future look like? And so I think I would have it incumbent on all of us to think more deeply about the intersection of race, technology, and our future. You can find me on Twitter at CMcIlwain, CMCILWAIN.
Mm-hmm.
You can find me at charltonmcilwain.com, my personal website. And you can find me and many other folks and voices that are critical to this work at Center, or I should say criticalracedigitalstudies.com, the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. And so we are there.
Well, thank you, Charlton and Mutale, for coming on All Tech is Human for our live stream series today. Greatly appreciated. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We know there's so much more to work on and to have additional conversations and meetings. So please, everybody stay in touch with All Tech is Human if you go to alltechishuman.org. And also a big thank you to our partner, TheBridge. You can check them out at thebridgework.com. So Mutale and Charlton, thank you for being on this live stream today for All Tech is Human.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening. And we'll be back in 2 weeks.